Jose, thank you so much for agreeing to be interviewed by the McGill International Review's media team. I was wondering if you could tell us about the blog that you've decided to write for MIR.
So the blog that I started writing this term is called Colombian Peace Watch, and it is going to be following the implementation of the Colombian Peace Agreement that was signed by the Colombian government and the insurgency guerrilla FARC.
Can you give us some context to the Colombian Peace Agreement?
So the armed conflict between the Colombian government and the FARC specifically has lasted for 52 years. And in 2012 approximately, actually even before that, both the government and the FARC realized that they were not going to get anywhere with the war. There wasn't a side that had a clear landslide victory over the other. So they decided to sit down, negotiate, and try to reach a consensus despite having very diverging views on what Colombia should be like. So after very intense negotiations, in 2016, they announced a peace agreement. And the president decided to put the agreement through a plebiscite so that he could ensure that a good number of people in the Colombian population endorsed the agreement. So there were many campaigns. A lot of people were against it. There are certain sectors in the country that still have a lot of contempt for the FARC. There are also some sectors that have contempt for the Colombian army or the paramilitary, which is another group. Colombia has a lot of different groups, not just the FARC and the military. And in the end, the results of the plebiscite were shocking because the no won unexpectedly, despite what the polls were saying, by a very, very small margin. So the country was left in utter chaos and in a lot of confusion. So then there was a lot of expectation, international expectation for this agreement, because in a world where other conflicts seem to be getting worse and worse and more violent, Colombia seemed to have finally finished a 52-year-old war. So after that, seeing the situation, the Nobel Peace Committee decided to award the Nobel Peace Prize to Juan Manuel Santos in a way to say to the country, do not let this opportunity go away. The no might have won, but you need to get out of this limbo right now. So after his victory, a new agreement was written. There were different proposals from different sectors of the country that were taken into consideration. And the new agreement was released. This time, President Santos decided to not make it go through a plebiscite, but to just have it be directly implemented in Congress.
So you've brought the peace agreement with you today. I was wondering if you could tell us what specifically is in the peace agreement.
So this is the printed version of the Colombian Peace Agreement, the final one, not the first one. And it is constituted by 6 points. The last point of the agreement is basically a chronogram on the implementation, different protocols that should be followed to ensure that everything goes on smoothly. But then the other points are more specific to issues in the country. So the first point of the agreement is about doing a rural reform, an integral rural reform in the country. The second point is about guaranteeing political participation to the FARC, which they haven't had before. The third is to ensure a bilateral ceasefire so that there are no more atrocities, so that both the army and the FARC stop shooting each other and also causing collateral damage. The fourth point is finding a solution to the problem of illicit cultivations of drugs. And the proposal was to create a voluntary program so that the people who are planting these drugs can have subsidies and develop another alternative kind of income that isn't illegal. The fifth point of the agreement is a very controversial one. It's on the transitional justice system that was established, the special jurisdiction of peace, and it will be sanctioning all of the actors of the armed conflict that have committed war crimes or crimes against humanity under international standards.
What do you think has worked?
So far, the levels of violence in some sectors of the country have indeed decreased, and we don't have the amount of damage or casualties that we used to have in some areas of the country. The latest rate of members of the military in the military hospital has gone down by at least 90%. And the FARC, for the most part, have also decided to go on with the agreement. They gathered in the 26 or 27 special zones where they were going to leave their arms and then demobilize so that they could transition into becoming civil people. Another thing that was successful was the disarmament process. And basically around 7,000 weapons were given to United Nations officials. So the fact that there was an international verification is a very positive thing. And very recently, the room for the special jurisdiction of peace just opened, and they already started listening to people. Just today, they started listening to women who were victims of the armed conflict, victims of war crimes, sexual violence, these kinds of crimes. So there has been a few positive things going on, I would say.
So you've mentioned all the things that have worked. What hasn't worked? What has yet to be solved?
So the rural reform, that was like the entire first point of the agreement, and that was at the heart of the FARC insurgency, has basically not happened. And right now, whilst in some areas of the country, the violence has decreased, in other areas of the conflict, it has either remained the same or has increased even. And the reason why this is happening is because before the peace negotiations, the FARC were actually, in a way, governing many peripheral areas in the country. Some of these areas had a lot of coke plantations on top of that. So what happens is that once the FARC, which had control of these territories, leave the territories, the government, the Colombian army, has to take control of the territories, but it has to compete against all these other armed groups that also want to have control of the territories, and especially of the coke plantations. On that note, the illicit cultivations rate has not gone down. It has actually increased. And the whole program of substitution of illicit drugs, it was supposed to be voluntary. It's being very slowly implemented in some regions. But then the government, parallel to that program, is also doing a forced removal of illicit cultivations program, which is a very confusing, ambiguous message to send to the people who want to voluntarily substitute. So that's one of the problems. And another huge problem right now is that because of the tenuousness of the implementation, because Congress is taking its time to either ratify or reject the different articles that the agreement has and turn them into laws, many people in the zones where they were gathered, many FARC people, ex-FARC combatants, are leaving the zones right now. According to United Nations, the latest rate was 55% of people left these zones. And where are they? Nobody knows why they left, what they're going to be doing now, if they're joining new groups. Finally, the problem with Colombia is that the FARC is not the only insurgency guerrilla group or the only violent group. They were the biggest guerrilla in Colombia, but they were not the only one. We also have the ELN, which I would say is the largest one now, given that most of the FARC demobilized. And the ELN, even though the government is trying to do peace negotiations with them, they recently massacred policemen in Barranquilla, and that forced the President Santos to stop the negotiations and to go back to war, essentially.